there seems like there's another part of that depression sequence, which is also like somehow the world is to blame for me failing to get my wife something for her birthday. There's some sort of external, like, well, I should have had something you're looking for. So the depressed person goes, there's something wrong with the environment.
Well, one of the things that also happens in depression is an increase in volatility, and volatility is tightly associated with anger. And it's underdiagnosed by physicians because depressed people tend only to be volatile to people who are lower than them in the status hierarchy. And so they'll be perfectly fine in the doctor's office, but they'll snap at their children or their wives and externalize some of that. So part of emotional dysregulation.
This is the psychological concept of displacement, and this was not my insight, but the insight of psychologists hired by the U.S. government in the early 70s. They found that baby boomers were displacing their anger at a world of nuclear weapons. And I know you've written on this too. And I certainly, I grew up, I'm a Gen Xer. And when I was 12 years old, I was subjected to this apocalyptic nuclear movie about nuclear weapons called The Day After.
That was 85, I think, or 82? 82. 80, yeah. 83.
And,
right.
And so you can't do anything about the nuclear weapons. We can't. We've a lot of reasons why, but basically we know that, if two countries got rid of the nuclear weapons and then went to war, the first thing they would do would reconstruct their nuclear weapons. So everyone sort of had this sense. So then we displace or scapegoat our fears of nuclear weapons onto nuclear power plants. And so the anti-nuclear movement makes this shift in the 70s where they stop trying to, they don't totally stop, but they know they can't get rid of nuclear weapons. So they start to try to get rid of nuclear power plants. And I thought that was one of the most interesting cases of kind of collective displacement. I interviewed folks about it and asked if it was conscious. And everyone said no. It wasn't like they had a meeting and said, we can't get rid of nuclear weapons, so we're gonna get rid of nuclear power plants. But I think it's clearly what was going on. And I now see displacement, which I think we can call scapegoating, maybe fairly, in a lot of different circumstances where people
some of it's lack of clarity of thinking, right? And that goes along with that depressive tendency as well. Are nuclear power plants linked to nuclear weapons? Well, yes, they're technologically sophisticated. So there's that linkage. You need nuclear power plants to build nuclear weapons. And so, and that's all bad because it's apocalyptic and malevolent, and fair enough. But again, you need discrimination in thinking. And we're also at a point where we think discrimination is always a bad thing when all it is, in its positive guise, is the ability to separate out what isn't good from what is good. And we have to do that all the time. So we have to be very careful with that. And so
one other point on nuclear. Oh, sorry, Jordan.
No, go ahead.
Oh, just one other point on nuclear. I think there's also, I interviewed a close friend who is not totally convinced of the roles of nuclear. And I said, it sounds like part of what you're upset about with nuclear is that nuclear weapons have stabilized relations between nations. Political scientists call it deterrence, created peace between nations, not just the US and the Soviet Union, but we now see it with India and Pakistan. And that really that peace was created through a bomb rather than through rationality and brotherly love. And she's a very sophisticated person. And she said, yeah, you got it. Of course, that's depressing that it was the bomb that achieved peace rather than rationality.
It's not that depressing because partly, look, I think around 1983, we all made a collective decision that things were good enough so we shouldn't blow ourselves up. I think that was lurking under the surface ever since World War II. It's like, well, maybe we should just call the whole thing off and burn everything to the ground, and you see that, you think, oh no, that didn't happen. It's like, well, these people like Stalin and Hitler, like I really think Hitler's fundamental motivation was to see Europe destroyed and in flames. He got exactly what, world domination and utopia for Germany. Well, look, there's this psychoanalytic adage, if you don't understand the motivation, look at the consequences and infer the motivation. Hitler committed suicide in a bunker while Berlin burned and Europe was in flames. It's like, yeah, that's pretty much exactly what he was aiming for. Why? Well, that's a good question. Why? Are you so sure the whole goddamn enterprise just shouldn't burn? and the end of consciousness and all of its suffering. And I think we kind of decided, well, no, that's a premature judgment. We could still make things good enough so that we could justify our own existence to ourselves.
And the flip side of that is the reason they created the bomb was to end a war and to prevent war. That was the reason. That, people condemn nuclear because they think the motivations were wrong. The motivations were not wrong. I quote Niels Bohr. Niels Bohr, the great father of quantum mechanics, he before the bomb is invented, he says to Oppenheimer in 1944 in New Mexico, he says, this bomb is going to end war as we know it. It's going to have to end war. But that was why they were racing to create the bomb, is because they wanted to stop Hitler from building it, and then they themselves prophesized. The scientists knew that it would bring an end to war. Now, I don't think that made everybody happy, though, because I think some people had a really different vision of how to end war. We know they did, which was through brotherly love and rationality, and that didn't happen. Now, when the Cold War ends in the late 80s, early 90s...
It happened a bit, because even people like Stalin, who was pretty much as bad as you could get and still be human, didn't blow everything up.
Oh,
and
yeah.
So that is, there, like, in some sense, there's some non-trivial brotherly love and rationality still operating, even in the most...
Yep.
Right?
I see what you're saying. Yeah. But it was for self-interest, right? It was like he didn't want...
Look, if you're far enough gone, you'll cut yourself just so you can bleed on someone else. So
yeah, I think you make a good point. I think you make a really good point. Yeah, it turns out that these when we call everybody that when they get the bomb, when a country gets the bomb or they're about to get the bomb, one of the things that we say, Americans say, is we say, well, we can't let them get the bomb because they're suicidal. If Kim Jong-un gets the bomb in North Korea, well, he's suicidal. Well, that turned out not to be the case. So I think you're absolutely right. I was
so far.
Yeah.
So far.
Yeah. And, and I would just add too, it was like when the Cold War ends and the threat of nuclear war goes to very much lower than what it had been, the people who wanted something to see apocalypse in shifted from nuclear weapons to climate change. That's when it occurred. And it's one of these things that's difficult to prove. But it is notable that climate emerges as the new apocalyptic threat when the threat of nuclear war declined significantly. And it also
and there is something deep about that too. I mean, it's not accidental that the Bible has an apocalyptic book at the end of it. It's like this idea that everything could end and that everything could fall apart. I mean, that's true in life. You have apocalypses in your life all the time. And it's very daunting to think about that. It's hard not to fall into a pit while you're thinking about that. And so we do have to have a serious discussion about how to protect ourselves against unwarranted apocalyptic thinking. Well, that's all playing out too with the COVID issue at the moment. So human psychological frailties, we have to take them seriously because we're a planetary force. So